The ultimate test is approaching for Khamzat Chimaev. He's going up against his most formidable opponent in Gilbert Burns, who's a former title challenger, number 2 contender of that welterweight division. With all the unknowns about the young Khamzat Chimaev, it's best to take a deep look into his training and his sparring to really get down how good this guy actually is and what his chances will look like against Gilbert Burns. Regarding his game plan, regarding the way he throws punches now, the progression from that Li Jingliang fight, which is actually a fight that we didn't see much out of him, especially when it comes to the stand-up. This fight with Burns will most likely be on the feet longer than any other of his UFC fights, given the fact that Burns has great takedown defense and the best Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu artist Khamzat's ever fought in his entire career, even going as far to say as Gilbert Burns probably being the best BJJ fighter in the welterweight division. And in some ways, it's the closest you can kind of get to a bigger version of Khabib versus Charles Oliveira. Even though Burns and Oliveira do grapple differently, the experience, the skill, and all of that are both at an elite level. So it's safe to assume that Khamzat is going to stand with Gilbert Burns more than any of his previous fights in the UFC. And if you want to go back and take a look of how his stand-up looks in the past, years ago, of when he fought Ikram Aliskerov, where he could not take the guy to the ground, so the fight had to be on the feet. You saw some things about Khamzat Chimaev in that fight, but a lot of those mistakes had to have been addressed years later. But the questions are always going to arise. Now, noticing from the way that Khamzat throws his punches, number one, they're really good in form. He has good rotation, extension, and snap with all of his punches. A lot more emphasis though on his right hand. His right hand is nice. You can definitely tell he has a lot more confidence in his right hand compared to the left. The noticeable thing about him is his hand speed is scary for his size. The guy is a giant welterweight. A guy that big should not be able to punch that quick. He generates a lot of power with his punches due to the form of them and natural force and speed he has with his punches. Combine that with the fact that he always has an element of surprise to catch the opponent down the middle with that right hand of his, just like he did with Gerald Mearshart. And definitely against someone like Burns, who doesn't have a great chin, he can put the guy out with a similar kind of shot. You can see a lot of confidence in his right hand. The way he's able to snap it out there, the amount of power he's able to generate with it specifically compared to his other hand, and oftentimes doesn't have much telegraph with his right hand. It's a scary weapon that he has. But also with the speed that he operates on, you can see how tense and compact he is when he's hitting a bag. It always looks like he's tightening his neck, his back, just stays really tense when he's throwing punches. This could be a factor as to why he doesn't get hurt too much when he gets hit. For an example, he got hit a lot by Aliskerov, ate some punches and walked right through them. The fact that he's always tensed up when he's throwing shots or when he's in close range with the opponent, it will allow him to take a shot to the chin at any moment, because he's never really relaxed, he's never really loose. And this overall can make him a very physical fighter, almost like a tank in front of you, offensively and defensively. He hits hard and you can hit him hard, he could kind of take it. But the drawbacks of this is, it's going to be difficult for him to stay elusive, like having slick head movement or something like that. And it's the biggest negative I saw out of all these training and sparring videos. Even when you correlate it to his fight with Aliskerov back in the day, he doesn't really move his head too much. He's very keen on picking up his hands and guarding punches. And it was interesting to see him spar with Darren Till because he was doing just that. Training with Darren Till, Darren has been a variable in the training camp of trying to mimic Gilbert Burns. Notice how the southpaw Darren Till switched into orthodox, throwing overhands, left hooks, and trying to stay in Khamzat's face, giving Khamzat a look like he's fighting Gilbert Burns. Darren Till is lowering his stance just like Gilbert Burns does. Now, he doesn't have Burns' footwork, who's always in and out, and he actually moves in long strides, but notice Khamzat's attacks. Uppercuts, knees, framing, acting as a longer fighter trying to intercept a shorter fighter's head movement. So you can see here he's drilling to potentially land some devastating shots on Gilbert's aggression, especially with the fact that Burns is always keeping kind of a lower leveled stance and also looking for those hooks and overhands, which are his best weapons. He has a decent jab, a decent right cross, but it's mostly the left hook and the right overhand. He likes to dip with those punches often too. But taller fighters who go this route oftentimes leave themselves defenseless against the shorter fighters' looping shots. They're more thinking about the offense and trying to get away with their head movement rather than guarding up. And that is a criticism of Khamzat Chimaev, that he doesn't move his head that much. He just puts up a guard and blocks your shots, enters on you through that. That could potentially work for him in this fight, considering the fact that the looping shots are going to come and not necessarily straight shots from Gilbert Burns. And the fact that he does bring his hands up after throwing his punches and knees and stuff is an indication that he has good defensive training when it comes to his high guard. And given his hand speed, he's going to be able to pop up those uppercuts and guard immediately in case those shots miss, or Burns tries to counter him. Now this strategy is a very risky move, trying to counter someone with uppercuts when they're moving forward throwing overhands. If we're going to be honest, it usually does fail. Evident on how it works in MMA, the overhand usually beats the uppercut in exchanges. Now that's not a rule because the uppercut can beat the overhand. We've seen it in the past with, for an example, JDS and Verdum. But it usually comes down to defense. Always keep your other hand up, and footing placement. You usually want to step on the inside of an overhand when you're throwing this uppercut, instead of winging it out from a distance. Now the good thing about Khamzat is, he's not throwing those bolo uppercuts from a long range. He's kind of throwing them in short range, waiting for the shorter guy to come in on it. This will give him more rotation to pivot on the inside of the overhands and catch Burns in tight. Whereas most guys who've gotten hurt by throwing uppercuts, they're throwing it from long range, and usually when you're throwing those bolo uppercuts, it tends to automatically force your other hand down in order to generate all that leverage and momentum. Whereas the overhand has a natural head movement to it, dipping to a side, not just straight downward the way Darren Till is doing here. Darren didn't do much justice of dipping to a side when he's throwing the overhand. He's kind of just ducking down the center. And Burns does not throw them like that. When you're throwing an uppercut, your head is usually on the center line. This is what causes a lot of uppercuts to miss and a lot of overhands to land. But the one thing that is pretty interesting to watch here is he's backing up away from Darren Till. In fact, most fighters who fight Burns back up away from him. Even Kamaru Usman could not pressure him immediately in the fight when Burns was strong. Given the fact that Usman is also a wrestler, he didn't want to use those takedowns and go to the ground with a much superior grappler. So he was forced to meet the faster, super explosive, dangerous puncher in Gilbert Burns head on. This might be a similar kind of thing that's going to happen to Khamzat Chimaev as well, where Khamzat will probably try to pressure him immediately in the fight, but seeing that Burns can match his speed, if not even be faster, and also that Burns is going to be swinging these overhands and stuff, there is a level of danger that Khamzat is going to have to be wary about. And just like I mentioned before, if Khamzat ever brings his hands down, he could get clipped by Gilbert Burns for sure. I mean, oftentimes sparring with these middleweights, welterweights, and light heavyweights, the guy doesn't move his head much. You cannot do something like that against someone like Burns, who is extremely quick with his hands. And you were able to even see this back when he fought Aliskerov, the longest he stood up with someone in a fight. That is honestly the biggest issue I see with Khamzat Chimaev in all of his training and sparring videos. He rarely moves his head, and it's not a good sight. And that's not only for fighting Gilbert Burns, it's actually more concerning if he ever fights Usman, given the fact that Usman throws his punches down the straight line. He does show to have a pretty decent chin, not only from the sparring but also in his previous fights. He would be willing to trade punches and always come out on top with that method. And even at times being outsped by Aliskerov, he was still able to eat his shot and hurt Aliskerov with his own punch. I don't know if that same kind of dynamic is going to happen with Gilbert Burns, who potentially hits harder than Aliskerov does. The guy has legit one-shot knockout power. But we do know that if Khamzat does land one of these big strikes, I don't think Burns is going to be able to take them. The other issue that I do see with Khamzat, it's not as big, but it's the fact that his kicks are relatively slow and labored. They are far too slow from his punches. It makes it very difficult for him to use those against Burns and be effective, without Burns actually catching one of the kicks or countering him. It's the hand speed, the form, and the power that Khamzat has in his hands that's going to make a big difference when it comes to the striking game. Now, those are some of the negatives, the issues I had with Khamzat looking at his training and sparring videos, just objectively looking at him. When you look at some of the scary stuff he's able to implement, number one, he's really good at parrying. That can make it pretty difficult for Gilbert Burns to set up some of his looping punches, ultimately making a lot of them naked. And no matter how fast someone is, if you make their strikes naked, there's always a telegraph for the opponent to see, and you will be able to react to it accordingly, especially when you're longer. Khamzat's going to be much longer than Gilbert Burns, so Burns is going to have to make every setup and strike count behind his speed advantage. Number two, if Khamzat decides to try to push Burns backwards, his ability to keep himself in close range on the opponent no matter how they're moving backwards and always track them down is pretty scary, man. He's always in his opponent's face, always throwing shots to the head, to the body, intercepting which movement they're going to take, and has a constant pump out of jabs, just in case to interrupt any kind of action the opponent has. He even was able to do this against Darren Till, and Till didn't have much for him, and even forced Darren Till to clinch up with him due to all the pressure. Knowing that Burns is also a guy who attempts takedowns at instinct, for an example, look what he did in his last fight against Wonderboy Thompson, this could potentially cause some issues for him, as taking down Khamzat from the clinch is not his best method. And that is the end of the breakdown. I want to give a special thank you to Blockasset for giving us access to these sparring and training videos. This is going to be a wild fight, and I still don't know who I'm going to side with.